It looks so easy. Thousands of planes take off every day. But what if it goes wrong? A Russian ice hockey team is wiped out just minutes after takeoff.
In the same way that people remember the accident involving the Manchester United aircraft, this was effectively Russia's equivalent.
We could smell the smoke. We all were terrified.
With a plane full of fuel and the engines straining. Getting into the air is when a plane is at its most vulnerable.
Are you going to die or are you going to take off?
Take off, the most dangerous part of any flight. Russian ice hockey team Yaroslavl Lokomotiv are training for the first match of the season. Ice hockey is huge in Russia. Lokomotiv are as big as Manchester United. Tomorrow the team are due to fly to Minsk for the first match of the season. Centre forward Maxim Zuzarkin is expecting to play.
I packed my things. That's how it was. I'd set my heart on the trip. I very much wanted to go.
But the Canadian coach has some disappointing news for Maxim.
I wasn't selected for the first game in the season. I was told to stay behind and play one match with the youth team, after which I would be sent on to join Lokomotiv.
Maxim doesn't know it, but not being selected is the luckiest thing that has ever happened to him. The rest of the team board the specially chartered plane at Yaroslavl Airport.
I was particularly good friends with Sovchenko and Gurchev, as we'd known each other for a long time. We'd grown up in the same town. We played hockey together for 10 hours a day. We were just like brothers.
The pilot flying them to the match is Captain Andrei Solomentev. Alongside him, First Officer Igor Zhivelov. They're flying a Yak-42, a medium-haul Russian passenger jet that remains popular in Eastern Europe.
The Yak-42 was kicking around decades ago, but it's never really been modernised. It's still essentially an old Soviet-era aeroplane.
Both pilots are relatively new to the Yak-42, but they've racked up the hours on its sister model, the Yak-40. Just before 4 p.m, the plane starts its taxi.
Yak service clear for takeoff. Runway 05, wind 360 at 11.
As the aircraft begins its takeoff roll, everything appears normal at first.
Go on in first and then make a right turn to follow. Okay, thanks, we'll do that.
But as they head down the runway, they notice that the plane isn't accelerating fast enough.
They are not speeding up the way they should be, and the end of the runway is nearing.
The The captain can abort takeoff right up until he reaches what's called V1.
There's a point of no return, if you will. If there are any problems with the airplane before that 190 mark, then the pilot must abort the takeoff. There was confusion during that moment, and instead of aborting the takeoff, they tried to go for it anyway.
The captain overrules the flight engineer.
Rotate.
But when they pull back on the stick, nothing happens.
Captain calls out full thrust.
Full power.
Come on.
Then, every pilot's nightmare. They run off the end of the runway.
There would have been a lot of shaking, a lot of vibration. It would have been absolutely terrifying.
It's running over grass towards obstacles.
Both pilots now pull back on the stick with all their strength. They have to get off the ground. At last, the plane makes it into the air. Then, a few seconds later, the undercarriage smashes into an airport antenna. It's a fatal blow. The plane ends up in the Volga River, 2 kilometers beyond the end of the runway.
At just after 4 in the afternoon on Wednesday, the charter plane carrying almost the entire Yaroslavl locomotive KHL hockey team crashed shortly after takeoff, bursting into a ball of flame after clipping a runway antenna. 43 of the 45 on board perished.
When I arrived, it was already dark. The emergency crews were still on the scene. There was lots of police activity blocking off the airport. There were lots of emergency vehicles coming to and from the scene. The investigation had just begun, so nothing really was being moved. They were still making sure that they had everything secure. Everybody was listening to the news from Yaroslavl, and you got the sense that this was not just an ordinary plane crash, that this was something much bigger and that it had affected the country. The people felt like these players were their family in many ways. We knew that there had been one player that didn't make the team, and in a quick conversation with my producer, we thought that this might be that person just because he looked similar, same age. And so my producer ran up and found him, and sure enough, this was Maxime, who was the player who had missed the flight. He was very much in shock, actually, because he was still processing what had happened. He was very somber, very sullen, and really you can tell that it had not completely sunk in what he had missed, how fortunate he was as a person, but also there was a sense of guilt that he wasn't with his team.
I can't really describe the feeling. As if your world had come to an end and everything around you and within you had broken down.
Russia is plunged into mourning.
In the same way that people remember the accident involving the Manchester United aircraft back in the 50s, this was effectively Russia's equivalent.
All we knew at that point was that the plane was trying to take off, and it had clipped a beacon at the end of the runway. Didn't make it much more than 6 meters into the air, and then it rolled to the left and crashed in a ball of flame.
The investigators are under intense pressure for answers. Why did this takeoff go so catastrophically wrong? Alexei Morozov, technical director of the Russian Air Investigation Commission, takes charge. Morozov knows that takeoff is the most dangerous part of any flight.
Accidents tend to happen at takeoff because it goes from a cold start to demanding a high degree of technical integrity, a lot of power from the engines, a lot of things that can potentially go wrong.
Morozov begins his investigation with the one thing he is sure of. The Yak was sluggish on the runway. He starts with the basics. The plane was refueled just before takeoff. Could the fuel itself have been contaminated? Samples are sent for chemical analysis. The Yak's black boxes are recovered. These should provide details of what every instrument on the plane was doing in the run-up to the crash, and a record of what was said in the cockpit. But they've been sitting in the Volga River for over 48 hours.
Come on. Rotate. Come on.
One of the black boxes was water damaged in the accident, so the investigators had to dry it out in a laboratory.
While they are waiting, the fuel results come back from the lab. There was nothing wrong with it. With the easy solution ruled out, Morozov starts working on a hunch. He searches for something that has caused crashes on takeoff before. Because there are haunting parallels between this crash and a tragedy that played out in Madrid just 3 years earlier. Spanair flight JK5022 is preparing for takeoff from Madrid airport. The plane is a McDonnell Douglas MD-80, a popular medium-range passenger jet. It's the peak of the holiday season, and the plane is jam-packed with tourists en route to Gran Canaria for their summer holidays. Among the passengers is Ligia Palomino. She's a doctor with Madrid's emergency services. She's off to celebrate her birthday.
We were all very happy because we were going to Gran Canaria with my husband and my sister-in-law. It was the first time that we were all going to be together on holiday for a week. We were very happy.
Check. Eyes protection.
In the cockpit, the captain is running through his pre-flight checks with the first officer.
The captain was an experienced pilot. He had flown with the Spanish Air Force on small transport aircraft and transitioned to MD-80 aircraft.
Flaps and slugs.
Everything is set for takeoff. Then, as they taxi out to the runway, the co-pilot notices a problem with the temperature sensor.
Temperature probe, Captain.
It suddenly rises from 56 degrees Celsius to 104. It's meant to warn the pilots if the plane is icing up, and this reading is clearly faulty. The pilot has to make a decision. Should he stop the flight and return to the terminal, or just carry on? After all, there's no danger of icing up in a Spanish summer.
It's always a tough call to stop a takeoff. You're under pressure to get the aeroplane where it needs to be. You've got passengers in the back wanting to get to their destination. It costs money, it costs time, and in the commercial world of airlines, that's a big decision.
The captain finally makes his choice.
Madrid Tower 5022, we have to exit the runway.
They decide that it's abnormal and they should look into it with a mechanic. You can fix the problem while on the ground and you can't when you're up in the air.
It takes an hour to solve the issue. The maintenance team eventually conclude that since the temperature sensor is meant to detect ice, and it is summer in Spain, they can go ahead without it.
So they pull the circuit breaker to solve the problem.
An hour and a half behind schedule, Ligia and her family are pleased to be on the move again.
I wasn't worried. I didn't worry because everything seemed normal. There was a good atmosphere in the cabin.
Electrical power. Check.
With the temperature sensor switched off, all the other systems now seem to be working fine.
Check.
Spanair 5022, clear for takeoff. Runway 33 right.
5022, ready to depart.
At a speed of 157 knots.
Rotate.
The pilots rotate the aircraft, which is literally pull back on the stick.
They're only feet off the ground when disaster strikes.
There are alarms going off. The aeroplane is in trouble. It starts to roll one way and then the other.
We're going down! We're going down!
The aircraft reaches a height of about 40 feet and then starts sinking. And
20th of August 2008. Spanair flight JK5022 crashes at Madrid airport just after takeoff. Of the 172 people on board, 154 die, most killed on impact or in the fire that follows. Just 18 survive. Among them, Ligia Palomino and her husband.
We had had a terrible accident and pain.
I suffered fractures in both my legs, broken ribs, and a head injury. When I think about the accident, I can't believe what happened.
Ligia's sister-in-law Gemma was one of those who didn't make it.
Como superviviente, lo que siento, nunca volveremos a.
As a survivor,
Nunca volveré.
I will never be the person I used to be. Nor will I do the same things I used to do before, and I miss many people. I feel the loss of other people who were in that plane as my own.
Spain's air crash investigation team are called in immediately. They soon learn about the faulty temperature sensor, but they also see that the engineers were correct. The sensor isn't needed in summer and can be switched off safely. But when the data from the black boxes comes back, it reveals something shocking. The pilots had made a basic error. At takeoff, a plane needs extra lift. That means you have to extend flaps and slats, which increase the area of the wing. And the MD-80 needs them more than most.
The MD-80 is known as an aircraft that doesn't fly very well at low speed without assistance from flaps. It's an aircraft that needs flaps on takeoff.
But Spanair Flight 5022 did not have its flaps and slats set. There was no way this plane could have successfully taken off. The Spanish investigation team already know that the pilots had failed to extend the plane's flaps and slats, wing surfaces that are vital for takeoff. But by listening to the cockpit voice recorder, the investigators learned that the pilots did extend the flaps properly when they first taxied out to the runway.
Flaps and slats.
Then, when they returned to the terminal to get the faulty temperature sensor fixed, they retracted them.
At some point between that decision to abandon takeoff and getting the aircraft back to the apron, the flaps are re-stowed.
But when they taxied out again an hour later, they failed to re-extend the flaps. The puzzle was, how could they forget something so crucial?
It's so essential to flight. It's almost hard to imagine that a pilot wouldn't put them out.
Flaps and slats are so critical that they appear on the MD-80's pre-flight checklists. Analysis of the cockpit voice recorder reveals that the pilots appeared to go through these checklists correctly.
The investigators find that the flap setting is actually called out on the cockpit recorder.
Flaps and slats.
But although they said it, they didn't actually extend them. But even so, on an MD-80 there is a fail-safe. An alarm should go off.
Usually the takeoff warning system would kick in.
So now the investigators face a new question. Why did that fail-safe fail? Why didn't the alarm go off? The investigators have a theory. The faulty temperature probe is powered by a relay that also controls the takeoff alarm and other systems. What if it was this relay that was broken, not the temperature probe? If that was the case, not only would the temperature probe have failed, but also the takeoff warning system, and no one would have spotted it. It's a plausible theory, but with the relay destroyed in the fire, they can't prove it. Flight 5022 remains one of Spain's worst ever air disasters. But could it perhaps help investigators understand the cause of other crashes at takeoff? In September 2011, an entire ice hockey team dies when their plane crashes just after takeoff in Yaroslavl. Chief investigator Alexei Morozov is hunting down the motor that controlled the plane's flaps and slats. As in the Spanair crash, perhaps the Yak pilots had failed to extend them. A week into the investigation, the data from the black boxes on the flaps and slats finally comes back.
The flaps and slats were set at the correct takeoff position, just like the stabilizer, which was also trimmed at the correct takeoff setting.
Takeoff power, please.
Morozov's hunch was wrong. It couldn't have been the flaps and slats. He's back to square one. Having already ruled out the most likely mechanical errors, the only other possibility left to Morozov is pilot error. But what could the pilots have done so disastrously wrong? Another incident half a world away offers one possibility and shows yet again how the slightest slip-up during takeoff can push a plane to the brink of disaster. Emirates Flight 407 is preparing to depart Melbourne for Dubai. It's a night flight on an Airbus A340. Petra and Miha, a young couple from Slovenia, are on their way home from the trip of a lifetime.
We've been together for 5 years now, and back then that was our first big trip together.
The trip to New Zealand was fantastic. We traveled for 2 months. We bought a car there, a camper van, and we drove the whole New Zealand.
With 257 passengers on board, the plane is nearly full.
We were good travelers, but in terms of being afraid of flying or not, probably Miha was always more comfortable with flying than I was. But I was never really scared.
We are sitting at the back of the plane in the 34th row.
We did check the films we could watch, the video games we could play.
In the cockpit, normal preparations are underway. The first officer is entering data into the plane's computers.
Emirates 407 pulling away from standing.
It's 10:15 p.m.
Clear to take off.
Just like the Yak flight, at first everything seems to be fine.
80 knots.
But then, acceleration down the runway is sluggish.
We were running down this runway for a really long time. I'm not an expert, but I remember thinking, okay, why are we doing this for such a long time? I mean, we didn't take off.
The captain can still abort the takeoff. But again, just like the Russian flight,
V1.
He chooses to pass the point of no return.
Captain calls rotate.
Rotate.
Co-pilot applies the normal aft stick and nothing happened. The captain at this stage has no option to stop it. It was only a go decision that he could make.
As they near the end of the runway, the wheels are still firmly on the ground. Then, again, just like the Russian flight,
the aircraft passed the runway threshold onto the grass.
The captain orders the pilot to pull up further.
So the captain called again, rotate. The co-pilot applied more input, a larger input, and this time the aircraft started to rotate.
I felt a bump. At that point, I didn't know that was the tail strike.
They're rotating the plane so steeply that the tail is hitting the ground.
There was millions of sparks at the window coming from somewhere from the plane.
We could all feel the vibration, and we could smell the smoke after that. We all were terrified.
pilot now pushes the throttle to maximum speed.
We just hold each other's hand.
I remember telling him I love him.
Hundreds of feet after the end of the runway, the plane limps into the air. But it's not over yet. The plane is inches from the ground and barely climbing. 600 feet past the end of the runway, it's just 2 feet above the ground. They've still got to clear the lights, the perimeter fence, airport buildings. Right now, they're way too low. Then, the plane's undercarriage hits an airport light. Somehow, the plane stays in the air. Next, the perimeter fence. If the undercarriage tangles with it, it's all over.
The worst feeling I had was that I was feeling totally helpless.
They clear the fence by inches. Finally, the plane climbs away, out of danger at last. Half an hour later, after dumping fuel to reduce weight, the plane touches down successfully.
I thought, this is the end. So yeah, when we left the plane, it was absolute relief. I just wanted to go away from the plane as far as possible.
Photographs taken by the investigators reveal just how serious the tail strike had been. The skin of the aircraft is entirely worn away.
There was a significant skin abrasion of the complete underside of the airplane's tail, which caused significant damage to the fuselage, but also significant damage to the rear pressure bulkhead.
But again, the question facing the investigators is the same as for the Russian crash. Why couldn't the plane reach takeoff speed before it ran out of runway?
And so we try and understand why the aircraft was not operating at the sort of speed you would have expected for what should have been a routine takeoff.
As we pull away from the stand, you would then be starting the engines, going through the starting procedure and then the after-start procedure to configure the aeroplane correctly for the takeoff. The performance data will already have been entered, and so it's a matter of running through checks to validate that everything is as it should be for the takeoff in terms of the configuration, speeds, the flight directors and flight guidance system is set up as it should be, and the crew typically review what they're going to do in the event of emergency occurring.
And I think that's basically what it was.
When they interview the pilots, the Australian investigators are staggered by the simplicity of the answer. It all goes back to those takeoff preparations, when the first officer put the data into the plane's computers.
So the crew enter the weight into the electronic flight bag performance module, it's a little program, and that calculates the speeds needed to be entered into the aircraft systems for takeoff. So it knows the length of the runway, for example, at Melbourne, it knows the temperature, the wind, and the air pressure, so it can work out exactly what performance is needed, or what can you do from that runway.
But the first officer made a simple error.
But of course, just like any computer system, garbage in equals garbage out.
He typed in the wrong weight. The first officer entered 262 tons, when it should have been 362. At takeoff, things are so critical that one digit nearly killed 300 people.
So that caused the flight calculation computer to compute a wrong V1 and a wrong rotation speed for the aircraft, a speed at which they were just not able to take off.
The thrust is too low, the aircraft's too slow, it doesn't lift off as planned.
The plane only survived because the pilot finally overrode the system to achieve full power. It was an extraordinarily narrow escape. The investigators described the incident as the closest Australia has ever come to a major air crash.
This was a lot closer than any of us would wish. That's one of the reasons we've put so much effort into understanding how this happened and why it happened.
In Russia, the investigators are aware of the frightening similarities between what happened in the Emirates flight and their Yak tragedy. The difference being the Yak flight didn't have a happy ending. So was a crew miscalculation responsible for the plane's crash? A Yak-42 aircraft has crashed into the Volga River just outside Yaroslavl in northern Russia. All 37 members of the Lokomotiv Yaroslavl hockey team have been killed. For Russia, it's like the Manchester United air crash. The question Alexei Morozov of the Russian Air Investigation Commission wants answered is why had the plane been so sluggish at takeoff? One possibility is that the crew had made an error. But the black boxes seem to show that they carried out all the pre-flight takeoff procedures correctly. To try and find out what kind of error the crew might have made, Morozov and his team run a simulation of the doomed Yak flight. They're troubled by what emerges. As it sped down the runway, the aircraft was subject to an unexplained braking force. It was this that stopped the plane from accelerating properly. But what was that braking force? Looking at the data more closely, there are no obvious signs of the brakes not working properly. But the investigators do see something else. As the pilots try to get airborne, the strange braking force actually increases. Why would anyone brake harder when they're trying to accelerate? It makes no sense. For a while, the investigators are stumped. But then Morozov has an idea.
If the braking system is working properly, then you have to look at the way the aircraft is being operated. Was the crew doing something that was somehow slowing the aeroplane down?
Morozov starts researching the backgrounds of the pilots. He notices that Solomentev, the captain, had spent more of his career flying Yak-40s than Yak-42s. The two planes are similar but not identical. Morozov and his team start to explore the differences between the two aircraft. One thing leaps out at him. On the Yak-40 and the Yak-42, the pedals which control the foot brakes are different. On a Yak-40, during takeoff, the pilot puts his feet fully on the pedals. But on a Yak-42, the pilot should rest his heels on the floor and just put his toes on the pedals. What if the pilot had got confused and put his feet fully on the pedals as he would have done on a Yak-40?
The investigators decided to actually carry out a full-scale test and see precisely where things started to go wrong.
As part of the test, Morozov uses a Yak-40 pilot, just like on the Yaroslavl flight. In the cockpit, the pilot instinctively places his feet in the correct position for a Yak-40 and not a Yak-42. As he pulls back on the stick to simulate takeoff, his feet automatically depress the pedals. As he pulls back harder, as any pilot would during a failed takeoff, the pedals get pushed harder. And on the Yak-42, that means he is pushing harder on the brakes. Morozov believes that this is what really happened on the Yak flight. As the plane starts its takeoff run, the captain, used to a slightly different pedal layout, was resting his foot on the brake pedals, inadvertently pressing the brakes. Because of this, the plane wasn't going as fast as it should have been. So he pulls back harder, bracing himself against the floor. But by doing that, he was pushing down even harder on the pedals, accidentally increasing the braking force. When they finally lift off, they're going so slowly, a stall and crash is inevitable. So the Yaroslavl locomotive ice hockey team and many others die, all because the pilot put his feet in the wrong place.
I don't think it'll be forgotten. How could we forget the team? The lads came down to Yaroslavl to play, and all of them died here. There were many local players adored by so many fans. Their traditions won't get forgotten.
President Medvedev issued a declaration that this incident would change the way Russia does air travel, change Russian skies, if you will. He grounded all Yak-42s until the investigation was complete.
Further investigation proves that both pilots' conversion training from Yak-40 to Yak-42 had been poorly carried out. And during that period, both had continued flying Yak-40s, something the regulations prohibit. Getting an aircraft off the ground pushes planes and pilots to the limit. All of these accidents highlight how even the tiniest error can turn into a disaster during takeoff, one of the most dangerous parts of any flight.